Ryan, when should we open up? How should we open up? What do we need to know about what Governor Newsome said about workers' comp and how is that going to affect things? And just any advice you can give on how we should handle that in the best way possible.
Well, the state and the counties both have guidelines that need to be followed when it comes to opening up. And some people misinterpret it the way that they're phrased as guidelines. They are called guidelines because they are broad enough to cover different topics that may not apply to every single particular business, but they are actually backed by various health orders, both by the executive and laws that exist both in the state and county. So they should not be looked at as optional things to follow. And these guidelines call for trying to telework as much as possible, first of all, and then on basic safety issues, there is physical distancing, so keeping that social distancing in place, use of face coverings by employees, customers and clients, frequent hand washing and sanitizing, and training of employees. And so one of the most important things to do is you get a copy of the state guidelines, and there's guidelines for both offices and for construction sites. So depending on which one you're going to be using most, or depending on the situation, these are the ones that you should be followed. And the counties have similar guidelines that sometimes say exactly the same thing, sometimes just provide a bit more detail. But they all encourage the basics of try to keep teleworking as much as possible and various sanitation requirements. And for the training, this is important, not only because it's in the guidelines, but because the state has changed the workers' compensation system. So now if somebody is working and they contract COVID, then there's a presumption that they got it at work, which means that it is a workers' compensation compensable injury.
Right.
And for somebody who might just be, self-quarantined with a bad cold or flu symptoms for 2 weeks, it's not really a big deal. But if there's somebody that's in the hospital on a ventilator for 2 months, that's a potentially large claim. Now, this is not a, mandated you're automatically in the hook, but it's a rebuttable presumption. So if you've got a situation where you're following all of the appropriate state guidelines, you've got trainings, you've got an acknowledgement form where the employee says, I'm going to be following all these trainings, and you've as part of the guidelines that are out there, there's typically temperature checks that are taken for everybody on each day. So if you're following all these steps, you can say, look, nobody here in our office environment is ill. Nobody had symptoms. This one person got symptoms, and we immediately kept them home, had them self-quarantine. And looking at what has happened with them, it seems pretty clear that they did not contract this at work. So you can rebut that presumption. You can challenge a potential workers' compensation claim. So as part of that, and as part of the training that is required under the guidelines, everyone who does come back to the office ought to be signing an acknowledgement form. And that form should have in it all of the steps that are required so that they know use of face coverings, social distancing, proper cleaning. Employees should be checking their own temperature and checking their own symptoms before they come to work. I know plenty of employers who've created a system that require each employee to certify before they even come to the office each day. Yeah, I've checked myself and I do not have these symptoms. I do not have a fever. I do not have a temperature above like 100 degrees. And that they have been trained in all the things that they ought to be doing with the hand washing and other hygiene measures. And so if you've got somebody signing this acknowledgement, and you can call on them to acknowledge, I'm going to be also following safety procedures outside of the office as well, then that serves a double purpose of, number one, you've got the training. Number two, you've got something that you can use to potentially rebut this workers' compensation issue.
Right.
And you've also even got sort of number three, what do we do with an employee that starts refusing to follow the rules?
Right.
Because I have seen questions from people who are, we've got people that really want to come back to the office, and all these people seem very focused on safety. And then we've got a couple people who seem a little lax, and them coming back makes everybody else nervous. And so you want a good written policy that you've got the acknowledgement with, so that once people slip or start blowing off safety measures, you can impose discipline on them, and there's a clear, hey, here's the statement that you signed saying these are all the safety measures you're following. You're not doing it, and here's the disciplinary results of that, and you need to start following that very quickly, or the disciplinary consequences will escalate.
Gotcha. Okay. So the big one is that, I mean, the onus does fall on the firm, right? Because we're gonna go ahead and assume that if they contracted COVID, there's a very good chance that they contracted it at work, and that very good chance it's going to be a workers' comp claim.
That's right. I mean, the silver lining to it is that you're not going to get a civil claim against the firm from an employee saying, I contracted COVID and now I'm suing you.
Right.
But what you do want to, one of the other important reasons to follow the guidelines is that there's a potential exposure for like whistleblowing retaliation, right, or just like any other Cal OSHA type regulation. If you've got a company that's not following safety and then a worker raises issues about it and then subsequently gets disciplined for something else, gets a negative performance review, they'll say, aha, I raised a safety concern and you are just retaliating against me. So to take away that potential avenue of attack, that's another important reason to take out those state and county guidelines and make sure that the company is following all of them. And so when an employee raises a safety concern, you can say, we share that concern and it is actually being addressed for our policy right here. If there's somebody who's not following it, let us know and we will follow up with that person and make sure that they are. And that way you can neutralize these potential retaliation claims that employees might be able to bring against the company because of safety concerns. And if they have safety concerns that are outside of the guidelines or are kind of on the irrational level, you can, my recommendation is to acknowledge them, make the employee feel like they've been heard a little bit, but then also go through and say, here's what the best practices are being recommended by the state and county, and we're following that, and that should address your concerns. But
Gotcha.
If somebody persists with something that's kind of irrational, you don't need to bend over backwards for them.